Tonight, we begin with a development that the Kremlin feared in private, dismissed in public, and ultimately failed to prepare for. Not a slow-moving operation signaled by weeks of visible troop buildups and satellite imagery, but a rapid and decisive action that unfolded in a matter of hours. Hours that exposed the fragility of Russia's border defenses, hours that undermined the confidence of commanders who had assured Moscow their sectors were secure, and hours that triggered a level of institutional panic within the Russian military not seen since the earliest days of this war. What Ukraine did this week crossed a line Vladimir Putin had relied upon to hold. When Ukrainian forces moved decisively into Russia's Kursk region, this was not a symbolic raid or a limited incursion. It was a calculated operation that challenged a central assumption underpinning Russia's entire defensive posture, that Ukraine would never dare take and hold territory on Russian soil. When that assumption collapsed, the Kremlin did not respond with the calm, controlled authority it likes to project. Instead, it reacted with confusion, denial, and a flurry of contradictory statements that revealed just how unprepared it was for this moment. According to multiple sources, the first response from the region was a frantic call to Moscow, not a routine update, but an extraordinary appeal that bypassed established chains of command. This was not protocol being followed, it was protocol breaking down. The message was stark. The situation had deteriorated rapidly, and local forces were incapable of containing it. For months, there had been quiet signals that Kyiv was preparing something unusual, not formal announcements or official briefings, but patterns familiar to intelligence analysts. Elite Ukrainian units repositioned discreetly. Western-supplied armored vehicles appeared in unexpected locations. Communications went silent. Long-range strikes slowed, suggesting ammunition was being conserved. Then, abruptly, the usual rhythm of Ukrainian operations stopped altogether. And in this conflict, when Ukraine goes quiet, it rarely stays that way for long. For Russian military observers noticed these anomalies too, including influential pro-Kremlin bloggers who often detect problems before official channels acknowledge them, but they were dismissed. The Kremlin's confidence rested on a single belief, that Ukraine would never risk escalation by conducting a large-scale ground operation inside Russia. Putin assumed Western weapons restrictions, diplomatic caution, and fear of escalation would restrain Kyiv. It was a strategic bet, and it failed. In the early hours of August 6th, Russian border monitoring stations initially reported what they believed to be a reconnaissance operation in Kursk Oblast. Such incidents are not unusual in border regions during an active war, but within hours it became clear this was something altogether different. Ukrainian forces were not probing defenses, they were overwhelming them. Mechanized brigades, supported by armor, artillery, drones, and electronic warfare, advanced rapidly against units that were never designed to repel a full-scale assault. This was the moment Russian commanders realized the conflict had changed shape. Ukraine was no longer operating solely within the constraints Moscow believed it could impose. The advance was swift, coordinated, and decisive. Within half a day, Ukrainian forces had pushed deep into Russian territory, bypassing defensive positions that in many cases existed largely on paper. The border units stationed in Kursk were not hardened frontline troops. They were conscripts, reservists, and internal security forces tasked primarily with preventing unauthorized crossings, not stopping a mechanized invasion. When confronted with a combined arms assault, they simply could not hold. By the end of the first week, multiple independent sources, Ukrainian statements, Russian military bloggers, Western intelligence assessments, and satellite imagery, confirmed that Ukraine had captured significant territory, including strategically important transit points linked to energy infrastructure. Command posts were struck before officers could evacuate. Ammunition depots positioned near the border were destroyed, depots that had been left exposed precisely because Moscow never believed they would need defending. Ukraine did not merely cross the border, it systematically dismantled the command and control systems that would have enabled Russia to respond effectively. Communications were disrupted, logistics were targeted, coordination collapsed, and the Kremlin's reaction told its own story. There was no immediate coherent counteroffensive, no rapid deployment of elite units. Instead, Moscow sent reinforcements in fragments. Units pulled from other sectors. Reservists rushed forward, commanders unfamiliar with one another thrown together under pressure. Many of these forces walked directly into prepared Ukrainian kill zones. Western analysts now believe the operation was designed to test something fundamental: the resilience of the Russian military after more than 2 years of attrition. And in those first critical days, that resilience appeared dangerously thin. Orders were unclear, responses were slow, public messaging was contradictory. Vladimir Putin himself remained conspicuously absent from the airwaves. Behind the scenes, however, reports suggest a very different picture. Russian officials speaking anonymously describe a furious Kremlin with blame directed squarely at commanders who had promised security. Investigations reportedly followed. Dismissals quietly occurred. This is what happens when a system built on reassurance collides with reality. Ukraine's success matters for another reason. It directly challenges the narrative that Kiev is exhausted, short of manpower, or nearing collapse. This operation demonstrated planning, discipline, and operational creativity on a scale not seen since Ukraine's successful counteroffensives earlier in the war. It showed a military that has learned, adapted, and retained the ability to surprise. The broader implications are now coming into focus. Ukraine has gained leverage, militarily and politically, leverage in negotiations, leverage with Western partners, and leverage in demonstrating that this war is not frozen, nor is its outcome predetermined. For Moscow, the timing could not be worse. Putin faces competing pressures at home, hardliners calling for escalation, pragmatists seeking an exit, elites eager for sanctions relief, and a public increasingly weary of a war they were told would be brief. A humiliated leader under pressure is not a comfortable equation for European security. What happens next remains uncertain. Russia may attempt a counteroffensive, it may escalate politically or militarily, or it may quietly absorb the blow while recalibrating. But one thing is now clear: the assumptions that governed this war for more than 2 years no longer hold. The war Vladimir Putin started has quite literally come home, and tonight, for perhaps the first time since this conflict began, the Kremlin appears uncertain, not of its messaging but of its control.